Shalom Aleichem. Mishnah Yomi is continuing in Pesachim, chapter 2, Mishnah Ches, Mishnah number 8. Ein notlin kamach, we do not place flour. Now this is flour from one of the 5 grains we mentioned that can become hametz and can be used therefore for the mitzvah of matzah. But since they can become hametz, they are dangerous. So ein notlin kamach latoch charoset, we do not put it in our charoset. And the Pesachim point out this is not just the charoset we make for the Pesach Seder, but any sort of liquidy fruit dip. It was common, they would grind up fruits, make sort of dip, and you dip your meat into that. So we don't put flour into that on Pesach, because if flour exposed to liquid can become hametz pretty quickly, within 18 minutes, as we'll see. Olatoch chardal, and not within the mustard. So if they have some sort of ground up mustard, they're making some sort of dip, some sort of spice, a condiment. We do not put flour from these grains into the condiments because it could become hametz. Im naton yochel miyad. If you did add some flour into these, you have to eat it immediately, meaning before 18 minutes have elapsed. Rabbi Meir says you can't eat it immediately because there's a danger that some of it will start to ferment and become hametz immediately. The Mefarshim say that the Chachamim actually say if it's added to haroset, to fruits with the juice, it could become hametz immediately. But it's only when it's added to mustard that perhaps they could eat it immediately instead of having to burn it because it might already be hametz. Now, speaking of dips that we use for meat, they now switch topics to talk about how we prepare the korban Pesach, the offering itself, the paschal lamb. Ein mevoshlin at a Pesach. We do not do bishul on the Pesach. Bishul means cooking in a liquid, cooking in water. Lo b'mashkin, not with any juices, lo b'mei not with fruit juice either. Avol sochin umatbilin oso bahen, but you can anoint the meat, smear some sauce onto the meat and dip the meat into sauces. There's actually a discussion if this means during the cooking process with basting some sort of sauce, or it means davka after the roasting is done. We're going to see later how exactly the korban pesach is roasted, that after it's done, perhaps it could be eaten with some sort of liquids. Now the Mishnah finally gets back to the topic of the danger of hametz. May toshmisho shel nachtam, the water used by the baker. Now this is apparently if his hands are getting warm, he'll dip his hands, which have some flour, some dough residue, into water to cool them off. Yishafru, you have to dump it out. The water itself with little dough particles can become hametz and make other things hametz. So we've got to dump it, and again, we're going to dump it somewhere sloped so it all flows downhill and absorbs, something we talked about in Eruvin about wastewater on Shabbos. So as we don't want this water to be a pool of hametz dika water. Great, Mazel Tov, on to chapter 3. Mishnah Aleph, Eilu ovrin b'Pesach. These things you must remove on Pesach. There is a hametz problem here. Kutach habavli, the Babylonian kutach. This is a substance used as a dip that comes up frequently in the Gemara. Apparently it's made of rotten, moldy breadcrumbs and spoiled milk. So it has sort of a tangy spiciness to it. Don't recommend you make this at home, but they had a recipe. It was delicious. It was a fine cuisine over there, but it has breadcrumbs. So even though the breadcrumbs are getting old and moldy, they are still breadcrumbs and chametz. Shechar Hamadi, the Median beer. Now this was a barley beer, a chametz beer. Rav Papa was also made beer. He frequently made beer out of dates, which would not be a problem as long as it did not have grains in it. The chometz ha'adomi, the Idumean vinegar, which had some barley in it. The zitum ha'mitzri, and the Egyptian zitum, which is a drink containing barley, saffron, and salt. So some sort of Egyptian beer. The zoman shel tzaboyim, the water with bran soaked in it, used by dyers. So they use this to make red dye and to soak bran. The amilon shel tabochim, and an amilon is kind of it's like bread made of unripe grains, used by cooks. And this is it's not really for eating. It's dough placed around the edge and the top of the pot to sort of absorb the schmutz that's boiling over and absorb the smell. The kolon shel sofrim, and a glue used by the sofer. And this had some flour dust in it to bind together the paper or the parchment. Now, all of these items above contain some sort of hametz in some sort of quasi-edible form. Now, the Mishnah will bring an opinion that's more machmir. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, af tachshite nashim, even cosmetics. Now, these cosmetics contain hametz that's in an inedible form, like highly concentrated alcohol. Well, depending who you ask, that might still be edible, but typically the hametz that's in cosmetics is not something that's edible, at least not by humans. It's called hametz nukshe. It's like hametz that's over-hardened and inedible through normal means, but he also bans that. Ze'eklal kol shehu mimin dogan. Anything from these grains, these 5 grains, harei ze over Pesach. You've got to remove it by Pesach. It's hametz, even though the hametz is, not really typically human edible. Harei lelu be'azhara. And the Torah warns you about it with a prohibition, ein behem mishum karet, but not karet. So what they're referring to is eating actual hametz on Pesach is an iser karet, which is a very, very serious prohibition. Very bad. Do not try that anywhere. But eating this hametz nuksha, it's not really eating because it's not really food and it's not really edible. So if it happens to be accidentally consumed, again, it should not be consumed. It's an azhara. It's biblically prohibited, but it's not a karet. Have a great day and be well.